What happens when an entitled duchess walks onto a late-night talk show expecting royal treatment, only to discover that Hollywood doesn't bow to anyone? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that left audiences stunned and producers scrambling. This is the untold story of how Meghan Markle's appearance on Late Night with Seth Meyers turned into a complete disaster, ending with security escorting her off the set. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story will leave you speechless. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle's team arrived at the NBC studios. Word had already spread among the crew that this wasn't going to be a typical celebrity interview. The Duchess had submitted a list of topics that were completely off limits, demands that went far beyond the usual celebrity requests. No questions about the royal family, no mentions of specific controversies, and absolutely no discussion of her legal battles. But what really caught everyone's attention was her demand for editorial control over the final broadcast. Seth Meyers, known for his sharp wit and fearless interviewing style, had built his career on asking the questions other hosts wouldn't dare touch. His team made it clear from the beginning that while they respected her privacy, Late Night wasn't going to be turned into a promotional platform. The show had a reputation to maintain, and Seth wasn't about to compromise his journalistic integrity for anyone, royal title or not. As Meghan settled into the guest chair, her demeanor was noticeably different from other celebrities who had graced the show. There was an air of expectation, as if she believed the interview should revolve entirely around her terms. The audience, unaware of the behind-the-scenes negotiations, applauded enthusiastically as Seth began his introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle," Seth announced with his trademark smile, though those who knew him well could detect a slight tension in his voice. Meghan walked out wearing an expensive designer outfit, her expression serious, rather than the warm, engaging smile viewers typically expected from talk show guests. "Thank you for having me, Seth," Meghan said as she took her seat, immediately adjusting her posture in a way that seemed to claim ownership of the space around her. "It's great to have you here," Seth replied, his professional demeanor intact despite the unusual circumstances. "I have to say, it's not often we have royalty on the show." "Well, I prefer to think of myself as someone who uses their platform for meaningful change," Meghan responded, her tone carrying a subtle hint that she considered herself above the typical celebrity guest experience. Seth nodded, recognizing the deflection but deciding to ease into the conversation. "Your humanitarian work has certainly been well documented, but I'm curious about your transition from acting to royal life and then to your current endeavors. That's quite a journey." "It is," Meghan agreed, but her body language suggested she was already evaluating whether this line of questioning met her approval. "Though I think it's important to focus on the positive impact we can make rather than dwelling on personal transitions." The audience sensed something was different about this interview. Unlike other guests who engaged in playful banter with Seth, Meghan seemed to be treating every question as if it required careful vetting. Seth, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that his usual interviewing approach might not work with someone who appeared determined to control every aspect of the conversation. "Of course, positive impact is important," Seth said, maintaining his professional composure. "But our viewers are also interested in the person behind the public figure. What's it like navigating such significant life changes in the public eye?" Meghan's expression tightened slightly. "I think we should focus on the work, Seth. The charitable initiatives, the advocacy, the projects that actually matter to people's lives." The tension in the studio was becoming noticeable. Seth's producers, watching from the control room, exchanged concerned glances. This wasn't the natural, flowing conversation that made for good television. Instead, it felt like a carefully orchestrated presentation that Meghan was determined to control from beginning to end. "I understand wanting to highlight your work," Seth said, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "But this is Late Night, not a corporate presentation. Our audience connects with authenticity, with real conversation. Are you suggesting I'm not being authentic?" Meghan's voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Not at all," Seth replied quickly, though his expression showed he was taken aback by her defensive response. "I'm simply trying to have a genuine conversation with you." "This is a genuine conversation," Meghan insisted, her composure beginning to crack. but I won't be subjected to the kind of invasive questioning that the media seems to think they're entitled to. The audience was now visibly uncomfortable. What had started as anticipation for an engaging celebrity interview was turning into something else entirely. Seth, recognizing that the situation was deteriorating, decided to try a different approach. "Let's talk about your podcast then," he suggested, hoping to find safer ground. "That seems like a natural extension of your desire to create meaningful content." "Finally, a relevant question," Meghan said, though her tone suggested that even. This concession came with judgment about Seth's previous attempts. Seth's patience was being tested in a way that rarely happened during his interviews. He prided himself on creating a comfortable environment for his guests, but Meghan seemed determined to turn every interaction into a confrontation about media ethics and personal boundaries. "Your podcast focuses on important social issues," Seth continued, determined to salvage the interview. "What drives your passion for these particular topics?" "What drives me is the responsibility that comes with having a platform," Meghan replied, her tone suggesting that others, perhaps including Seth himself, didn't understand this responsibility. "Too many people in media use their influence carelessly." The comment hung in the air like an accusation. Seth's eyebrows raised slightly, recognizing that Meghan had just made a thinly veiled criticism of his profession while sitting as his guest on his show. The audience was beginning to pick up on the tension, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. "That's an interesting perspective," Seth said carefully, coming from someone who's made a career in media herself. "There's a difference between using media responsibly and exploiting it for sensationalism," Meghan shot back, her voice rising slightly. The producers in the control room were now actively discussing whether they needed to intervene. This was unlike anything they had experienced in their years of producing late-night television. Seth, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that this interview was heading toward territory that neither he nor his show had prepared for. Seth took a deep breath, realizing he was dealing with a guest unlike any other in his career. The accusation about media sensationalism had crossed a line, especially considering she was currently sitting on his show, benefiting from the very platform she was criticizing. "I think there might be some confusion here, Meghan," Seth said, his voice maintaining professionalism despite the growing frustration. "This show has always been about respectful dialogue and giving our guests a platform to share their stories authentically." "Respectful dialogue?" Meghan's voice rose, causing several audience members to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Is that what you call trying to pry into my personal life despite my clearly stated boundaries?" "I asked about your career transitions," Seth replied, his tone becoming firmer. "That's hardly invasive journalism. It's a normal conversation topic for anyone who's had your public profile." "Normal for who?" Meghan demanded, leaning forward in her chair with an intensity that made the camera operators adjust their shots. "For the tabloid media that's been stalking my family. For the journalists who twist every word I say." The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond typical celebrity banter. Seth's producers were frantically communicating through their headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation play out. "I'm not tabloid media," Seth said, his patience finally beginning to wear thin. "This is a legitimate talk show, and I've been nothing but respectful to you since you walked out here." "Respectful would have been honoring the interview parameters my team clearly outlined," Meghan shot back, her composure completely abandoning her now. "Instead, you're trying to turn this into some kind of gotcha moment for your ratings." "Gotcha moment?" Seth's voice carried genuine disbelief. "I asked you about your podcast and your humanitarian work. If that constitutes an ambush in your mind, then maybe you're not ready for public interviews." The comment struck a nerve. Meghan's face flushed, and her voice took on a tone that several audience members later described as entitled and condescending. "Not ready? Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" she demanded, standing up from her chair despite the interview still being in progress. "I've given interviews to the most respected journalists in the world. I've sat across from Oprah Winfrey. I don't need to justify my media readiness to someone who makes jokes for a living." The insult hung in the air like a slap. Seth's face showed genuine shock at the personal attack. Making jokes wasn't just what he did for a living, it was his craft, his art, and his contribution to public discourse. The audience gasped audibly at Meghan's dismissive comment. Someone who makes jokes for a living, Seth repeated, his voice now carrying an edge that his regular viewers had rarely heard. Is that how you see everyone who doesn't bow to your demands? As beneath your notice? I see people who use their platforms responsibly versus those who don't, Meghan replied, still standing, her voice carrying the kind of authority she seemed to believe came with her title. And right now, you're proving which category you fall into by asking normal interview questions. Seth stood up as well, matching her energy. By treating you like every other guest who comes on this show, if you wanted a controlled environment where nobody challenges you, you should have stuck to your own podcast. Challenge me. Meghan's voice reached a volume that made the sound engineers wince. You think you're qualified to challenge me? I've testified before Congress, Seth. I've met with world leaders. I've used my platform to create actual change while you sit here making fun of politicians. The contempt in her voice was unmistakable. Seth's jaw tightened as he realized that this wasn't just about interview questions anymore. This was about fundamental respect, and Meghan had made it clear she didn't believe he deserved any. You know what? Seth said, his famous composure finally cracking. You're absolutely right. I do make fun of politicians. It's called holding people in power accountable. Something you might understand if you spent less time demanding special treatment and more time remembering that titles don't make you immune to normal human interaction. Special treatment. Meghan's voice was now loud enough that audience members in the back rows could hear every word clearly. I asked for basic professional courtesy, something that apparently doesn't exist on this show. Basic professional courtesy works both ways, Seth fired back. It means not insulting your host on his own show. It means not demanding editorial control over content you're not paying for. And it definitely means not talking down to people like they're your servants. The words hit their mark. Meghan's face showed genuine fury at the suggestion that she had been treating people like servants, though her behavior throughout the evening had done little to contradict that assessment. How dare you? She said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow felt more threatening than her earlier shouting. You have no idea what I've been through, what my family has endured because of people exactly like you. People exactly like me? Seth's voice carried genuine confusion mixed with anger. What does that even mean? Late-night talk show hosts. People who ask questions? People who don't automatically defer to your perceived status? People who think they're entitled to pieces of my life just because I'm married into a public family, Meghan replied, her voice building back toward shouting. People who think my privacy, my boundaries, my basic human dignity are all fair game for their entertainment. I asked you about your podcast, Seth exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. Your publicly available podcast that you're here to promote. If that's too invasive for you, then why did you agree to come on a talk show? The question seemed to catch Meghan off guard for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her anger finding a new target. I agreed to come on this show because I was told you were a professional, she said, her tone dripping with disappointment. I was told you understood the importance of respectful discourse. Instead, I find myself being ambushed by someone who clearly has no understanding of the responsibility that comes with interviewing public figures. Ambushed, Seth repeated flatly, by questions about your career and your charitable work. Questions that any other guest would consider softballs. Any other guest doesn't have to deal with the level of scrutiny that follows me everywhere, Meghan replied, her voice taking on a martyred quality that made several audience members exchange glances. And any other guest doesn't come on this show acting like they're doing me a favor just by being here, Seth shot back. This is supposed to be a conversation, not a royal audience where I'm grateful for whatever scraps of information you decide to share. The royal audience comment clearly struck a nerve. Meghan's face showed a flash of something that looked like genuine rage before she composed herself enough to respond. If you can't handle interviewing someone of my stature with the appropriate level of respect, she said, her voice taking on the kind of formal tone usually reserved for official statements, then perhaps this show isn't the right venue for serious public figures. Someone of your stature? Seth's voice carried genuine disbelief. Do you hear yourself right now? You're talking like you're doing charity work by appearing on television instead of promoting your own projects. The confrontation had reached a point where both participants seemed to have forgotten they were on live television in front of a studio audience. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every heated exchange for posterity. The studio had become a pressure cooker ready to explode. Seth's producers were frantically trying to figure out how to salvage what had become the most hostile interview in late-night television history. But neither Seth nor Meghan seemed willing to back down from the confrontation that had consumed the entire segment. "You know what the real problem is here," Meghan said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone that made it sound like she was addressing a child. "You and people like you think that just because someone appears on your show, you own them for those few minutes. You think you're entitled to dig into whatever aspects of their lives will get you the best sound bites. I think I'm entitled to do my job," Seth replied, his voice steady but filled with barely controlled frustration, "which is having conversations with my guests. Not conducting interrogations, not ambushing anyone, just talking. Something that apparently requires your pre-approval now. My pre-approval exists because I've learned the hard way what happens when you trust media personalities to act with basic decency," Meghan shot back, her finger now pointing directly at Seth. "Every question becomes a trap, every answer gets twisted, every moment of vulnerability gets exploited. Then why are you here?" Seth demanded, his voice rising to match hers. "If you think this entire industry is corrupt, if you believe everyone in media is out to exploit you, then why did you agree to come on this show? Why subject yourself to what you clearly consider beneath you?" The question seemed to hit Meghan like a physical blow. For a moment, her composed facade cracked, revealing something that looked almost like panic. But instead of reflecting on the validity of Seth's point, she doubled down on her anger. "Because I have important work to share with the world," she said, her voice taking on an almost messianic quality. "Work that transcends the petty entertainment that passes for journalism these days. I thought, perhaps naively, that this show might be different." "Different how?" Seth asked, his tone becoming increasingly incredulous. "Different by not asking you any questions? Different by letting you deliver a prepared statement and calling it an interview? Different by showing some respect for the gravity of the issues I'm trying to address," Meghan replied, her voice rising again. "Instead, I find myself having to defend my basic right to privacy against someone who clearly doesn't understand the difference between public interest and public curiosity." "I asked you about your podcast," Seth shouted, finally losing the last vestiges of his professional composure. "Your publicly available podcast that you're here to promote. If discussing your own work constitutes a violation of your privacy, then you've completely lost touch with reality." The audience gasped at Seth's blunt assessment. Several people in the front row looked genuinely shocked that the confrontation had reached this level of intensity. Meghan's face showed pure fury at being told she had lost touch with reality. "How dare you question my grip on reality?" she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You sit here in your comfortable studio, making jokes about world leaders, while people like me are actually trying to make a difference. You have no idea what real responsibility looks like." "Real responsibility?" Seth's voice carried genuine amazement at her arrogance. "Real responsibility is showing up to work every day and treating people with basic courtesy. Real responsibility is honoring your commitments instead of trying to rewrite the rules to suit your ego." "My ego?" Meghan's voice cracked with indignation. "This isn't about ego, Seth. This is about dignity. This is about not allowing myself to be diminished by people who think entertainment value trumps human decency. You've been diminishing everyone around you since you walked through that door." Seth fired back, his patience completely exhausted. "You've insulted my profession, dismissed my staff's work, and treated this entire experience like you're doing us some kind of favor. If anyone's dignity is in question here, it's not yours." The comment seemed to break something inside Meghan. Her careful composure, already cracking throughout the interview, finally shattered completely. "That's it," she said, standing up so abruptly that her chair rolled backward. "I don't have to sit here and be attacked by someone who clearly has no understanding of what public service actually means. This interview is over." "You don't get to decide that," Seth said, also standing, his voice carrying an authority that reminded everyone this was his show. "You're a guest here, not the host. You don't control this environment just because you're used to everyone else bowing to your demands." "Watch me," Meghan replied, reaching for the small microphone pack attached to her outfit. "I'm not subjecting myself to another second of this hostility." "Hostility?" Seth's voice carried genuine disbelief. You mean the hostility you've been showing my staff since you arrived? The hostility you've directed at me for asking basic interview questions? Or just the hostility of being treated like everyone else instead of royalty? Meghan's hands were shaking with rage as she fumbled with her microphone equipment. The audience watched in stunned silence as what had started as a celebrity interview devolved into something resembling a public breakdown. "I am not everyone else," she said, her voice carrying a tone of absolute conviction. "I have responsibilities, platforms, and obligations that go far beyond your little comedy show. I don't have time for this amateur hour nonsense." "Amateur hour," Seth repeated, his voice filled with genuine hurt beneath the anger. "This show has won Emmy Awards. We've interviewed presidents, Nobel Prize winners, and actual world leaders. But apparently, none of that matters because we didn't treat you like the special exception you think you deserve to be." Seth's producers had been communicating frantically throughout the confrontation, but now they were faced with an unprecedented situation. Their guest was literally trying to leave in the middle of a live broadcast, and the host was clearly beyond the point of trying to salvage the interview diplomatically. "Security," Seth called out, his voice carrying across the studio. "I think we need some assistance here." The word security seemed to snap Meghan back to awareness of where she was and what was happening. Her face showed genuine shock that Seth had called for security, as if the possibility of facing consequences for her behavior hadn't occurred to her. "You're calling security on me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Seth replied, his voice now calm with the finality of someone who had made a definitive decision. "You're someone who came on my show, insulted me and my staff, disrupted a live broadcast, and is now trying to leave without fulfilling your professional obligations. Security isn't being called because of who you are, it's being called because of how you're behaving." Two security personnel had appeared at the edge of the stage, clearly unsure how to handle a situation involving such a high-profile guest. Meghan looked at them with the kind of outrage usually reserved for genuine persecution. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who genuinely believed she was being treated unfairly. "I came here in good faith to discuss important work, and I'm being thrown off the show for refusing to be disrespected. You're being escorted off the show for disrespecting everyone around you," Seth corrected, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "For treating this studio like your personal kingdom and everyone in it like your subjects. That's not how this works, regardless of what title you think you carry." As security gently but firmly guided Meghan toward the exit, she turned back towards Seth and the audience with one final statement that would be replayed countless times in the days that followed. "History will remember how I was treated here tonight," she declared, her voice carrying the dramatic weight of someone delivering what they believe to be a historically significant pronouncement. This is exactly the kind of media hostility that drives people away from public service. "History will remember that you couldn't handle a conversation about your own podcast," Seth replied, watching as she was escorted off his stage, "and that you turned a simple interview into a masterclass in entitlement." As the studio doors closed behind Meghan and the security team, Seth turned back to his stunned audience. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. "Well," Seth said, running a hand through his hair and attempting to regain some semblance of his usual composure, "I guess we'll be going to commercial a little early tonight." The credits rolled over a studio that was still buzzing with the electricity of confrontation. Audience members sat in their seats, many still processing the unprecedented scene they had just witnessed. Seth's staff moved quickly to restore order to a set that felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster. What started as a routine celebrity interview had become something else entirely, a clash between two fundamentally different worldviews about respect, responsibility, and the basic expectations of human interaction. The aftermath would be discussed and debated for weeks, but in that moment, everyone in the studio knew they had witnessed something that would define both careers involved. That's the story of how an entitled duchess learned that not every stage comes with a throne, and not every audience is required to bow. What did you think of Meghan's behavior during this explosive interview? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity confrontations that you won't see anywhere else.